Just to start, we are seeing that the national oil companies in the region are aligning their strategies with the overall sustainability targets, with the net zero commitments. But we think that the pathway or the energy transition will be somewhat challenging for the regional peers compared with the internationally listed peers, basically. And this is largely because, you know, the high exposure or high reliance of the regional economies to the sector, but also because we expect to see less direct pressure. So we wanted, as you mentioned, we wanted to test the impact on credit metrics. So what we did is we looked at the spending trends for the international peer groups and what that meant in terms of contribution from low carbon investments. And these include, for example, projects in carbon capture, utilization and storage, but also investments in renewables, and extrapolated it on the regional peers. What we did is we also looked at planned greenhouse gas reduction targets for the international peers and extrapolated it in terms of spending needs for the regional national oil companies. And based on our hypothetical and purposefully exaggerated stress test, we estimate that the regional national oil companies would need to spend somewhere between 15 billion to 25 billion on average in aggregate, at least until 2026, while still preserving their net debt to EBITDA and credit metrics. We calculate that this would be on average below 2 times, at least over the next 3 to 5 years.
توقعتم في تقريركم الأخير أن تكون شركات النفط الوطنية في الخليج بحاجة لتخصيص ما بين 15 إلى 25 مليار دولار سنويا للاستثمارات المنخفضة الكربون. كيف توصلتم إلى هذا الرقم وكيف نقارنها بالخطط الفعلية المعلنة من شركات النفط الوطنية في الخليج؟
Based on what we discussed, we did a contribution impact or contribution assessment on total spending and what that means in terms of low carbon investments. Approximately, it's around 20% of total capex or total capital expenditure needs. We don't think that this is necessarily going to be fully materialized. So we think that this is exaggerated for several reasons, but very briefly. Differences in the energy mix between the regional national oil companies and the international peers. So clearly, companies with higher refining exposure would need to spend more to achieve their targets. Maybe secondly, the regional national oil companies benefit from lower greenhouse gas intensity levels, meaning they would need to spend less to achieve their targets. And maybe very lastly, but the overall underlying environment, in our view, has shifted the focus, at least in the short to medium term, from the question of energy transition to the question of energy security.
عن أي نوع من الاستثمارات نتحدث؟ هل تركز شركات النفط الوطنية أكثر على خفض الانبعاثات من عملياتها الهيدروكربونية أم على تنويع محفظتها لتشمل الطاقات المتجددة والنظيفة؟
That's a good question, and I think there's no straight answer. So clearly there are companies that are basically introducing climate mitigation objectives, and these include, for example, investments in renewables, investments in water stress and heat waves, but also, so particularly for adaptation, the focus would be on water stress and heat waves, and then for mitigation, it would be more on renewables, for example, and hydrogen investments.
ما هي آخر الاتجاهات عندما نتحدث عن إصدار السندات أو الديون المتعلقة بالاستدامة في المنطقة؟
So maybe just to set the scene in terms of the big picture, we are expecting on a global basis the global green, social, sustainable and sustainability-linked bond issuance to hover around the $1 trillion level this year, and translating into around a market share of between 14 to 16%, which is slightly higher than 2023 levels. And clearly in the region, we are expecting a ramp up also in issuance, albeit coming from a relatively low base. You know, the Middle East contributes less than 3% of the total global GSSS issuances. But maybe in terms of trends in the region, you know, in 2023, in 2023, green, social, sustainable, and sustainability-linked bond issuance in the region more than doubled to reach around the 23 billion mark in 2023, which compared with 2022 levels. Most of these were coming from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and we expect this trend to continue. In terms of the types of issuances, it's mostly green bonds, and we expect this trend to continue. And as a reminder, green bonds are financial instruments that raise funds for projects with environmental benefits. So, as we mentioned, the renewables, this also includes green buildings, sustainable agriculture, just to give a few examples. And we expect this trend to continue. And maybe in terms of what's driving the issuance, so clearly we've seen a lot of sovereign issuances, but also we expect the large corporates, including the government-related entities, to continue in terms of issuance to meet their sustainability targets.